Welcome to Complex Conversations, brought to you by the Bluebee Collective. I'm your host, Chasity Short, and I'm so glad you're here. Complex Conversations exist to provide education, advocacy, and empowerment to families living lives with medically complex kids. I bring together families with leading providers in the complex world to help make your life just a little bit better. Today we are joined by Kathryn Hamill Pacheco, who is an occupational therapist and a leading provider and expert in sensory processing. Katie is the author of How to Be a Brain Executive, and she is also an ex-teacher, so she's able to bring her love for learning, her ability to describe things in a really digestible, understandable way to us when it comes to the complex sensory system. So enjoy the show, and I'm so glad you're here. Katie, thanks so much for joining us. I've been so excited to talk to you. I know we've been talking for months now, trying to get on the schedule, so I'm really excited that you're here and for you to share with all of my audience all the amazing information that you have. So could you please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you do?
Yeah, I'm so excited to be here. I love sharing this information. I am an occupational therapist, and I used to be a teacher. And I often say, once you've been a teacher, you just can't stop teaching. And since I've moved into my work as an OT, I've just started teaching in a different way. And I've gotten, really involved in sensory processing and integration. I honestly never expected to, and that is just what my caseload has done. So I started really looking into, how this works in the neuroscience, and there's so much great information, and I started teaching my kids about it. We talk a lot about parent education, but I got really into teaching my kids about it. So I was so excited. I got to publish a book last year that teaches kids about sensory modulation. And then what I found is that I've done all this work to kind of translate the science for kids, but that parents are really liking it and wanting to hear more. So I think of myself as a translator. I love the neuroscience. I love to learn about it. We have so many greats in the field who have done such amazing research and brought us to the place that, we understand so much more about sensory processing and integration. But I'm a big believer in that. Who holds the knowledge holds the power idea. And so we don't want to hold the power as clinicians. We want our parents to, and our kids and our families and, the teachers who work in the classroom with these kids. So just that idea of sharing, trying to share the knowledge and share the power.
I love that so much. And I think that, I had a medically complex kid, and even though I worked in that hospital, I'm a physical therapist. I have all this education. I understand things. When we would be admitted, there were times where even I felt like I don't understand what's happening, and no one's really stopping to explain the big picture. And
Yes.
So I think that's the most important thing. One of the most important things that we can do as clinicians is not gatekeep, and maybe no one's gatekeeping on purpose, but making sure, stopping and being like, I have this information and it's my job to translate it to you. And I love that so much. So can you tell us, what is sensory processing?
Yes. And, I think we're at this place where sensory processing has blown up so big, and we talk about it so much. And it is so important, just like you said, to stop and look at, what are the basics? What is this in a big picture? In my most simplest terms, sensory processing is how you take in information from the world around you and inside of you, make sense of it so that it's useful. So these are the things that, you might be hearing or seeing or feeling by touch from around you. Taste and smell is also part of how we get information from the environment. And then we have some detectors and receptors within our body that tells us how our body is moving and how it's positioned and how it's feeling. And so those are all of our sensations, and it has to come in and kind of be processed so that it's useful. Because if you think about sensory information in everyday life, if you're listening to this podcast, you're using your hearing or your auditory system to gather this information. If you're watching, you're using your sight. Everything that we do has a sensory component in it. And I think we're at this place where there's so many great conversations about how important this sensory information is.
And I think that there's a lot more. I feel like the parents of children with autism have done such a good job about putting information out. So now the general public knows a lot more about sensory issues than maybe we did even 5 years ago.
Yes.
So it does feel a lot more accessible. But now I think it's great to really dive in and be like, okay, we see fidgets and we see, kids with earphones. Let's talk about what does all this actually mean?
Yes.
So I know coming up in the therapy world, sensory integration was the term that I always heard. Kids coming in for sensory integration. Mm-hmm. How is that different, or is it different from sensory processing?
As a clinician who works with sensory processing and integration, one of the things that we talk about a lot is some of our terminology it overlaps. It means slightly different things. A lot of times we talk about sensory integration when we're thinking a little bit more about kind of that theory aspect of it. A lot of times, our families are using the word sensory processing. And to me, if you are a family, if you are a parent, if you're a caregiver, the difference between sensory processing and sensory integration doesn't really matter as far as the clinical terminology. I like to say that, but I should say that I think the word processing and the word integration can really help us understand what's happening and what's important with the sensory information. So I think about sensory processing. When we take in sensory information, it first gets to, our eyes or our ears or our skins or our organs as sort of a raw product. And your nervous system and your brain does these incredible things to process that information and make it to where it's in kind of a usable form. And I liken this to processing in everyday life by cooking. And I like to say that if my daughter came to me and said, "Mom, I'm hungry," and I gave her 2 raw eggs, technically I've given her food, but I've not given her anything that's useful for her to fulfill her need to eat. But if I take those raw eggs and I process them, so with eggs, I'm going to cook them. I'm going to put them in a pan, add some heat, maybe some butter, and I cook them, then I've processed them or turned them into something that's useful for her. She can eat those scrambled eggs and get the food that she needs. And what we found with sensory processing is we do talk about dysfunction. And for a lot of individuals, as we grow up as kids, we learn naturally just to process our sensory integration to where it comes in a raw form and it turns into something useful. And you know how development sometimes just happens seamlessly. But for other individuals, they need a little help to get from the raw form to the useful form. And that's when we talk about sensory processing in like a therapeutic setting. And then the other word, integration, I think about integrating things into a whole. So if you take a puzzle, if you have a 100-piece puzzle and you pick up one piece of the puzzle, that one piece isn't really meaningful. You can't really tell what's on it if you look at the one piece of the puzzle. But if you put it together or integrate it with all of the other pieces, all of a sudden you get this big picture that's meaningful. And sensory processing is the same way, or sensory integration is the same way. I use a buzzing sound. If you're outside and you hear a buzzing sound, well, in and of itself, a buzzing sound is just that. Then if you can integrate it with what the context in your environment, if you're in the garden, then it's likely a bee. Okay, so then I've added a piece to the puzzle. Now it's a bee buzzing, not, an airplane overhead. And then we can add it to things that we've learned. If I'm an avid gardener and taken a course on gardening and I've just learned about bees as pollinators, I'm going to hear the buzzing, identify it as a bee, and then say, oh, this is a really great thing. They're helping me garden. So I've kind of put those puzzle pieces together to where that buzzing noise, which in and of itself is just that, I don't even know what it is, and then made it into kind of a useful picture that I can understand. So that's the way that I think about processing and integration and how I try to talk to families about it.
Where have you been my whole therapy career? Because I feel like that was a pretty simple explanation for something I've never really understood. The puzzle piece.
That I tell you, that just makes my heart sing because I love explaining this stuff. I will lie awake at night thinking like, how can I explain, this part or that part? It's really fun, and it should be simple, because if it's complicated, we can't put it into functional use. And so it needs to be simple enough to where when I'm in everyday life, I can, just grab what I know and put it to work.
Yeah, it's great. You've done a great job. And so then we have kids on, is this true? Do we have kids on both sides of the spectrum of sensory needs? Some kids where things feel too much, they're getting too much information, or they feel like they're getting too much. Some kids where they feel like they're not getting enough.
Yes, and it's even bigger than that. So I think two pieces of information that I should give. One is, with health and sensory health and mental health in general, a lot of times we start by saying, we've identified this set of people who seem to have a dysfunction. And so years ago, the great OT Jean Ayres said, you know what, this subset of kids seems to have a difficult time with XYZ, and she's done all this work. And now we understand sensory processing and integration. But I think a lot of times in health, what we start by saying, this applies to this population, then we start to say, wait a minute, this could be helpful for everybody. And that's where we are in sensory health. We looked at dysfunction, and then we said, you know what? Everyone has sensory systems. Everyone processes sensory information to some extent. And to get back to your question, we all have sensory challenges and difficulties at some point. It's normal in everyday life. So when we start talking about, yes, some people seem to be over responsive to sensory information. Some seem to be under responsive. There is this whole spectrum. But when I talk about it, I always like to say, to some degree, being over or under responsive or having a piece that's not functional in the moment is completely normal for everyone to do. Sometimes when it starts happening over and over again and it's impeding in our everyday life, that's when we start to say, hey, is there a sensory processing dysfunction here? Do we need some therapeutic help? But yes, back to your question. Yes, for the same sensory input, for some people, it seems to be just right. For some people, it seems to be too much, and for some, not enough. If you're a family of 5 and you're going to all watch a movie, miraculously, a family of 5 all agreed on a movie to watch for one. But then you all sit on the couch and, somebody grabs the remote and sets the volume so that it's perfect. It's just right for them. The loudness that's just right for them might be too loud for someone else, and it might not be loud enough for another person. So we talk about some of those differences. And again, part of it, if it's functional and it's typically functional, then it's part of our everyday. Everyone has sensory differences and everyone has sensory challenges.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I like being able to bring our two worlds together. So I specialize in medically complex kids. You specialize in sensory. And so being able to have this conversation, I think that when we think of sensory processing, a lot of people think of certain diagnoses. Autism might be one of them. But people don't normally think of profoundly disabled or very, very medically complex kids. And so that's one thing that I would like to talk with you about.
Yes.
Make this so that it's available for everybody who has a sensory system, right? Which is all of us.
Yes.
But also as we go through this, to kind of bring in that lens of the medically complex kid, because this is something that really in the complex world, it's not talked about. And it needs to be talked about because this is a system that has to be, we have to pay attention to, I think, and start doing a better job as a profession to, I don't know, just to bring it, these kids have sensory needs too, and how do we do that?
Yes.
So
I love that. And I'm so excited to be here because of that. And, like I've said before, we can't bring sensory health. We can't say that sensory health is to everyone. And by everyone mean everyone who is typical, which typical is a whole I know that term is kind of loaded, and I don't mean it to be that way. But if we say sensory health is for everyone, I think we have to mean that sensory health is for everyone. And how can we bring this to all of our populations?
Right. And it poses a specific challenge for kids who can't on their own maybe get up and fill their sensory needs.
Yes.
So that's why we have to become empowered as caregivers, whether that's parents, therapists, nurses, whoever is helping in this child's care team, in this child's world, to recognize it and then and get the information, become empowered to help that child reach those needs. So
yes.
Can we go through the sensory systems? I know like in elementary school, we all learn the 5 senses, right?
Yeah.
But in a more grown-up way, can you go through the sensory systems and let's talk about each one, and then we can kind of have a conversation about maybe how this could be met for the more complex kid.
Yes, absolutely. And I should say at the beginning of this, I'm going to try to do it fairly quickly. These are incredibly complex systems, but I do like to talk about what they are and what they do, what they offer us in everyday life. So in elementary school, we tend to learn about our 5 senses. And so we're often most familiar with those. We have our sight, and our sight lets us see the things around us, the colors, the shapes, also, how something is moving. If you think about, if you're watching a car go down the road, is that car stationary or is it moving? We understand that a lot as a function of our visual system. How 2 things relate to each other. The cup is sitting on top of the table. We know it's on top often because we visually can see one is above the other. And I have to pause here and say, I'm going to be describing sensory systems as they kind of work in general. And I do understand that, not everyone has a sense of sight that looks exactly like what I'm describing. And I think there's a place for being able to generalize because it gives us a foundation of knowledge. But I want to be so careful and say that, I don't want to leave anyone out. So I understand that kind of these general descriptions of our sensory systems doesn't get everyone. And I do respect that. And if we could have a podcast that would last 24 hours, maybe we could get there.
No, it is important to understand baseline of what a typical vision system is supposed to look like without any impairment. So I think that's a totally okay thing that we work off of that assumption.
Okay, perfect. So you've got your vision, and so that's going to give us some information about your environment. We've got our hearing, and so that's the sound that you can hear. And not only can we say, yes, there's a sound or no, but we can get information about the sound. How loud is it? How quiet is it? What is the pitch of that sound? Being able to understand spoken language is this incredibly complex process where we take these sounds that someone else produces and we're able to decipher them into words and meaning. And so all of that is wrapped up within our auditory system. Our sense of smell allows us to smell what's in the environment around us. And I like to explain for smell that things give off tiny little chemicals called odorants that kind of get out into the air. And it's when those little chemicals get to our noses that it's a chemical sense. So that's what alerts us that there's a smell in the area. And I like to talk about smell with safety. All of our sensory systems play a role in safety. But, often where smells can alert us to what might be safe in our environment. If there's a fire, the smell of smoke is often the first thing that's detected. So all of these systems have a survival piece to them.
I would just like to add that from now on, I'm going to tell my teenage boys that I am smelling strongly their odorants.
Yes, please do.
Okay, sorry.
Teenage boys, that's a whole different topic.
Yeah.
Your taste, we have our sense of taste that allows us to experience the flavor of what's in our mouth. And that allows us to say, I really like this food, or I dislike this food. And it also plays a role in safety. And we don't always think about that, but I like to say, at night after dinner, I'm cleaning my kitchen. I might spray Lysol on the countertops. And if I'm talking while I'm doing this, some of that Lysol in the air can come in contact with my tongue, and I taste it. And as soon as I taste that just little bit of a miss of Lysol, I am immediately alerted to the fact that that's not safe and I should, get away. So again, we see a survival piece with our taste and with all of our senses.
And isn't taste like when you get sick and you lose your sense of smell and taste? Are either of these connected to the desire to eat? Because if I can't taste food or smell it, I don't really feel like I need to eat.
It's not as exciting, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I think that that's a really great point. Or if something just all of a sudden tastes different, if you're used to things tasting a certain way and then you get sick, or, sometimes medications can alter our ability to experience those flavors.
Mm-hmm.
And so, feeding is such an important part for everyone's health, and it's absolutely impacted by your sensory system. So again, this is health for everyone.
We can go deeper into it, but when working on the oncology unit for lots and lots of years, those kids would lose, because of the certain chemos that they would get, they would lose a lot of their taste. And so you have these little bitty kids eating these really spicy foods because spice was the last thing that they could taste. So everyone's eating hot Cheetos and, just to satisfy that desire to taste something. So
yes, that's a great perspective. And I think, we can run off of that for a minute and talk about, we talk about sensory information like nourishment for our brain. Just like we need food for our body, our brain needs sensory stimulation for our brain. So if we're not getting it, we do want it, or we are lacking. So yeah, I think that taste helps to make eating exciting. And it's one, with toddlers, what do toddlers say? Yes, I want to eat this. No, I don't want to eat that. There's a part of that control, it tastes good. And so, yes, I want to eat it, or it doesn't, or I don't like it and I don't want to.
Yeah. Well, let's go through and briefly explain all of them, and then we can kind of go back and apply it to different populations.
Yes. Keep me on target.
Me too. This podcast will be 4 hours.
Yes, please. So then your sense of touch is that fifth one that we really are familiar with. And your sense of touch does an incredible amount to provide you information with what is contacting your skin. And if we think about our senses, when we talk about our vision, we have 2 eyes in one location in our head. When we talk about smell, you have one nose, one location, ears, mouth. Then you have your skin that feels touch, and your skin is an organ that covers every inch of your body. It is expansive. So I'm not only getting tactile information or touch information from one location, I'm getting it from my face, from my hands, from my back, from my legs, from everywhere. So we just have this broad place that we contact tactile information. And then we also get information about, okay, did something touch my skin? That's going to be my tactile system that alerts me. And then we can get information about what touches our skin. If you came behind me and you took the tip of a pencil and pricked my back versus a basketball and pushed it on my back, I could tell the difference between those two. So our tactile system doesn't just say yes or no a touch, but it informs us about what is touching us, where it's touching us. If I closed my eyes and you came and tapped me on the leg, I could tell you, oh, I was tapped on the leg, not on my shoulder. So it gives me information about what touches me, kind of what that might be, where it contacted me. And I can tell if something is moving across my skin, a stationary touch versus rubbing across my arm. It's all my tactile system informing me. And then we do talk a lot about our tactile system. The receptors are the little tiny things that let in your information, your sensory information, we call receptors. And we have a lot of them on the palms of our hands and on our face. So when we talk about touch, we often talk about our hands. And for humans, we've gotten our use of tools. If I have a pen and I'm holding a pen in my hand, you can think about the palm of your hand, how it contacts the pen. And so your sense of touch really informs your use of tools, a spoon, a fork, a knife, scissors, your pen. If you're working with Play-Doh, any of those things are going to really rely on your tactile system. And then we also have pain and temperature. So this is an expansive system. And then stepping from those 5 senses that we're really familiar with, we have 3 kind of hidden senses, or just ones that we're not as familiar with, and we can't see the receptors. We have our vestibular system, and your vestibular system is housed in your inner ear, and it's made up of tiny tubes and sacs that have water in them, and the lining of them has little hairs. And so anytime you move your head, that water kind of sloshes and it makes the hairs wave. And anytime those hairs wave, it sends a signal to your brain that says, hey, you're moving, your head is moving. And I like to use a water bottle to explain this system. I like to visualize tiny little water bottles in your ear. And anytime you move, it just sloshes that water. And that sloshing, that movement of the fluid is going to alert your brain that your head's moving. And what we see is that it's oriented in different ways. So it can detect if you're going like back and forth, nodding, rocking, if you're swaying from side to side, if you're jumping up and down, if you're spinning. Any movement of your head is going to be detected by this vestibular system. And I like to point out, we talk about the vestibular system, and so we talk about head movements because it is located in our inner ear. So it's going to alert the brain when your head moves. But I always like to point out that hopefully your head is attached to your body, which means that if your whole body moves and your head moves, you're still going to enact that vestibular system. So things like sitting up, your whole body jumping, walking, running, those whole body movements are going to elicit head movement, which is going to engage your vestibular system.
That's a great explanation with the water bottles. I love that.
I love the water bottles, and I have my kids imagine the water bottles because later we can talk about, how do we engage those sensory systems? And then I just say, how are you going to shake up your water bottles? It can be that easy. Your proprioceptive system is the next system. It is housed in your muscles and your joints. And so anytime your joints move or your muscles move, this proprioceptive system sends a signal to your brain. All sensory information is headed to your brain. So it says, hey brain, your arm's moving. So if I raise my arm up over my head, that movement of my joints is going to alert my brain, hey, that arm's moving. Or if I squeeze my muscles or relax my muscles, that tightening and relaxing of the muscles is going to engage that proprioceptive system. So how your limbs and your body is moving is going to be a part of that system. And then the 8th system is your interoceptive system. And this system informs us kind of our internal state of being, if you will. So when you, when you feel sick, that we all talk about, I feel sick. Well, what does that mean? It's kind of that inner feeling that you don't feel well. Your interoceptive system is helping to alert your brain, things don't feel right inside. That feeling of hunger is your interoceptive system. The inside my body feels like I need to eat. Well, we have to detect that sensation and alert our brain somehow. The feeling of fullness. I've eaten so much after Thanksgiving dinner. I just feel so full. Well, how do we detect that we feel full? It's that interoceptive system. And we can even talk about, the need to eliminate your bowel and your bladder. I'm sitting here sitting in the classroom, and then all of a sudden it's like, oh gosh, I really need to pee. I need to go to the bathroom. Well, what alerts us that we need to? That's that interoceptive system. So if you just stop and think about right now, what can you see? What can you hear? Is there a taste in your mouth? Did you brush your teeth and it still tastes minty? What can you smell? What's contacting your skin? Are you sitting on a chair or on a soft sofa? Do you have clothing on? Do you feel hungry or full? Are you moving? Are you sitting upright? Are your legs crossed one over the other? We have so much sensory information available to us at all times.
That is a great explanation of the whole sensory system. My son just walked in. I'm sorry.
That's good. Maybe he needed to know something.
Yeah, he's using his sensory system to come into the podcast.
Yes.
The interoceptive, is that what you called it? I've never even heard of that. How have I not heard of that?
There's some great programs that explain it. It's
you
kind
did
of
a
the
wonderful
newest
job explaining it. I feel like I feel like I understand it. You did a great job.
I really do love explaining it. Once a teacher, always a teacher. But the interoceptive system is kind of a newer system as far as us talking about it. And we can absolutely, I can send you some resources. So if you want to share it with your followers, that they can get some more information. It's incredibly impactful. Yeah.
Hold on, please. 29:57.
Colby, what do you need? I'm recording. Do not come in here.
Oh my gosh. Okay, can we go through the systems? And now that we understand what they are and kind of how they work, talk about meeting these needs, especially for kiddos who aren't typically developing.
Yes.
So
yes.
Before we do that, I have a question. Okay, so for kids that, I'm thinking of the kids that I work with, that their sensory information feels too much. The taste feels too strong. The wind blowing bothers their skin. Is that because their sensory systems are hyperactive, or what does that mean?
So that is a really good question. And so here we're talking about sensory modulation. And, sensory modulation has gotten a lot of press. There's this whole other world of sensory processing where it informs our movements. And we're kind of not even touching that today. But I like to at least alert people, there's this whole thing called praxis that is another incredibly important part. But when we're talking about your question, we're talking about sensory modulation. So I just asked, what are all the things you can feel and see and touch at this very moment that you weren't even aware of before I asked that question? And so what we find is that at any point in time, we have so much sensory information that is available to us that our brain simply cannot attend to it all. It has to have some way of deciding, what am I going to pay attention to and what am I just going to block out? And we call that sensory modulation. And I like to say, if you have a song on the radio and you turn it up, you're not changing the song, but you're modulating the volume. You're letting it be more, or other way, turn it down. To be completely honest, sensory modulation is incredibly complex. It starts from at the receptors and the nerves that even start to get that information from your eyes or your skin. It is modulated as it travels to the brain. And even once it gets to the brain, there's parts in our brain that's going to help to decide, what information do I need? How much of it? And what am I going to pay attention to? We don't all the way know exactly how all of these pieces happen. And so here's where kind of my teacher brain says, I like to explain it as a brain security team is how I explain it, because I think it's a good way to bring it into functional use. So we're all familiar with a security team at a concert. And what do? If you come to the concert or the football game or whatever it is, and you have a ticket, it says, okay, you're supposed to be here. I'm going to let you in. And if you come to the concert and you don't have a ticket, that security team is going to say, nope, you do not get to come in. So it regulates who comes in and who isn't allowed to come in. And if that security team is doing a good job, we find that, all the seats are going to be full. That concert's going to be perfect. Enough people to be exciting, not so many that we're overwhelmed. And so I like to think about the brain security team doing the same thing for sensory information. And here's where I just have to be honest and say this is kind of Katie's viewpoint of this. I'm not telling you this is exactly how the science works, and we don't even know. But the way that I think about it, which I think makes it functional, I think of my brain security team, and I think about it working in kind of two ways. One, how much of a sense is it going to let in? So, my feeling of my clothes, I didn't notice it before, but once I could say, what does your shirt feel like on you? I can kind of feel where my shirt is contacting me on my skin. If we have a child whose security team or their sensory modulation lets in too much of the feeling of their shirt, then we get these kids who we say are over responsive to sensory information. The feeling of that shirt might be so irritating that they just cannot pay attention to anything else. All of the tagless shirts, tactile sensory modulation. That's where, that's kind of where it came from. And so what we see is that, for maybe a large group of people, that brain security team is letting in a just right or a functional amount of the feeling of a shirt. Yes, I notice it. No, it's not going to bother me so much that I'm distressed or I can't pay attention to anything else. For some of our kids, that brain security team is going to let in so much of the feel of that shirt or the tag that it is overwhelming to them. It can feel like it hurts, that itchiness. They can be able to pay attention to nothing else other than that tag in their shirt or the feeling of, the sleeve around their arm that's just, they can't get away from that feeling. And then on the other side, we have kids who we say are under responsive, or their brain security team, if you will, doesn't let in enough of that feeling. And so these are the kids who just don't notice certain sensations very often, or not as much. That was the wrong way to say it. They don't notice the sensations in a way that's functional, that gives them the information that we need. Same tactile or your touch system. These are the kids that you can walk up behind and tap them on the shoulder. They don't even notice that you tapped them, right? That security team didn't even let that feeling in. So that's when we start to talk about modulation. And so, yes, we do have kids that seem to be over responsive or under responsive. And then we have kids who seem to seek sensory information. They want the kid tactile system who's touching everything or fidgeting. And, they might wear holes in their pants because they just keep rubbing and fidgeting with it. So we do see some variations in the sensory modulation, if that was an explanation that's workable for you.
Yeah, it's a super clear explanation. I think that's a perfect way to describe, that system. And I can see, thinking back in my experience with all of my patients over the years, okay, this kid's security team's a little too tight. This one's a little too loose. I can, that's a great way. You have such a gift because you're a teacher of explaining things in ways that we can understand. Thank you.
Thank you. And before we go on, I should say, I think my favorite reason for talking about the brain security team is, we can't talk about this without saying, well, then what? So, okay, this child who's over responsive and the feeling of their clothing is so bothersome. Like, we can't talk about this child without then saying, well, then what? How can we help? And what I have found is that it is incredibly hard for me to sit and explain to you how we can help your nervous system modulate that sensory information better. But if I start to talk to you about your brain security team, I can talk to you about, how could we help your security team block that sensation out a little bit more? So then it leads us into, how can we help? Because none of us are here because, well, that stinks. Nothing I can do for you. We're here because, I get that. And let's help try to make that a little bit better.
Yeah, I love that. That's a great way to explain. I mean, to other clinicians too, really. It's all very complicated. And unless you've spent years in this we all have these things that, like, I'm really, really good at this.
Yes.
And I'm okay, kind of not great at this.
Right.
So,
And when we all work together, that's when it works well.
right. And having the humility, like, explain it to me like I'm 3. Okay, now I get it.
Okay. I need things, we all, but that it helps when we're all speaking it in our own language and sharing.
It does. Okay, can we talk about the sensory systems and kind of how we can, for kiddos who aren't typically developing, or specifically for medically complex kids?
Mhm.
And medically complex, my definition is just somebody that has multiple diagnoses
Mhm.
whose diagnoses affect their daily life. They have
Yes.
multiple providers. You don't have to be, like my son, profoundly disabled to be considered medically complex, but you just have a lot going on.
Yes. And
More than just a single thing, which almost everybody does.
yes. And I love that. And I have to say here, here is where I am not, this is not my area of expertise. Yes, I've worked with kids who are medically complex. And yes, I bring my sensory lens into it. But this is where I think we can really partner and kind of put these pieces together. And then I have to stop and say, the real expert here, I'm so thankful that I've been able to get some schooling and do some extra studying on the sensory processing idea. And I love being able to do that. But when we're working with a child, the expert is the caregiver. It is not me. It is not you. It is, it's not the MD. The expert on the child is the caregiver. And so this is where, we can all collaborate. So if you're listening at home, I hope that this sounds like a collaborative conversation and that you say, oh yeah, I can see where this fits for my child, but I think I would do something a little different there. Make this yours.
Absolutely.
And
take the information and apply it to your life. Because you're right. I can know everything there is to know about a certain diagnosis, but I don't know anything about your kid, right?
Right.
You're the expert in your kid. And so that's where I always talk about you have to build a team with mutual respect with the people that have, who are the supposed to be experts or the doctors or the therapist or whatever. They can come in with humility and say, you're the expert on your kid. Tell me about, I'm going to tell you this information. You tell me how this applies to your child. And then we'll come together and make a decision.
Yes. And as we talk about some sensory pieces, we can talk about watching for a response. And then, yes, you are the expert. Nobody knows that child better than you. And own that because it's so powerful.
Absolutely.
But so yes, thinking about for the sensory, Chasity, I have to pause. I had a thought and now I'm just going to start talking and not making sense unless I had a place to go with this and I have
That's okay.
blanked out. You talked about, okay, now I got it. It's the nourishment. I got it.
Okay.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Okay. So if we're thinking about sensory processing, I like to say again that we think about sensory information as nourishment for the brain. Just like we need to eat food for our bodies, our brains need sensory information. It is part of just knowing that we're alive. Our brain knows that if we're alive and awake, that we're going to be seeing and hearing and tasting and feeling things. And so we see, if I can talk a little bit about typical development, in a typical child, we see this drive to get sensory information. I want to see that. I want to touch that. I want to play with that. I want to go over there. I want to jump. I want to run. It's this kind of natural drive. And I love, there's this great book, and I'm going to blank on the gentleman's name who wrote it, but he talks about building mental models in our brain. And I think about that so much with sensory information. When I'm learning about my tactile system, a baby is born with a tactile system, but they're not born understanding what all of it means. So every time they touch something, every time their skin contacts something, they're learning something about the object and what they're doing and how their tactile system works. Every time a baby sees something or hears something, it's forming that area in the brain that understands and uses that sensory information. And if we think about that, it becomes incredibly important to offer our kids sensory experiences. Yes, touch that. Yes, let's listen to this music. Yes, let's talk to you. And then I think when I'm working with a child who's medically complex, sometimes we see kids that, can't necessarily get up and go see that over there, can't necessarily contact all of those things in their environment, or if they want to look at something closer, they can't always influence their environment quite as easy as some of our other kids are. And for whatever reason that is, then we want to bring that sensory world to them, and whatever that means for that kid and that environment and that context. So this is where I think, you can talk about some of the kids that you've seen and say, this is a kid, how would we give them proprioceptive information or visual information, and kind of thinking about bringing the world to them, because it's healthy for their brain. Because end of the day, a medically complex kid is a kid, and we want to respect that and give them those opportunities.
Right. Yeah. And I'd like to say, I think it's healthy to look at this sort of stuff kind of as a baseline before we start. Kind of what we said before of, if I'm teaching a 12-year-old how to roll because they have a level of disability, that's their developmental progress at that point, I'm still going to be looking at the rolling of a typically developing infant. And that's my baseline that I go off of, right?
That's good. That's
good.
Yeah.
So that it's not negating where the 12-year-old is, but it's just having an informed full picture.
That's a good. Thank you for saying it that way to kind of enable us to talk about it.
Yeah. No, I think it's important, and I think if you can understand, typical development. Even if you don't understand all the intricacies, if you've ever seen a baby who's typically developing, you can kind of say, okay, this is kind of the process they go through to get to standing. But yeah, I think when you have a medically complex kid, specifically a profoundly disabled medically complex kid, we've got to change our thinking, because we don't, like you said, we don't notice all the things because we can move our body to get what we need. We're uncomfortable, we can shift.
Right.
We can go from here to here. Sometimes kids can't. We feel uncomfortable because the sun's too bright. We can turn our head. Sometimes people aren't able to do that. So
yeah,
just training ourselves as caregivers, and therapists too, but specifically the parents and the caregivers, because you're the one who's with them all the time. You're kind of the gatekeeper of that kid.
Yes.
Starting to understand, when you go outside, just take a second. What do okay, the wind is blowing. The sun feels warm on my head. And just kind of starting to train your brain into thinking that way, so that then you can look at your kid and say, okay, this is probably what he or she is feeling. And just have it that, in the front of your mind. And then you can help to start train the other people on your team who help care for your child, whether that's private duty nursing or grandparents or friends or whomever it is.
Yeah. And I think if I can jump in and say kind of even two ways, I think you can think about it as that sensory exploration, that nourishment for the brain. These kids might not be able to get that. And so we want to bring the exploration to them. And then, like you were saying, when is the sensory information or input not ideal, not preferable? When can we notice that and change it to help you be more comfortable? So kind of on both sides. How can I help you explore? And how can I kind of protect you from that sensory information that doesn't feel good to you?
Right. So for smell, let's just go through them and we'll talk about them. So for smell, some kids who have a trach and are ventilated, depending on if their trach is cuffed or uncuffed, they may have a little bit of air going through their nose, or they may have no air at all going through their nose. And so their sense of smell might be really, really dampened. I would say really strong smells, like really strong lemon, that sort of smell. A lot of times those kids can still get some of that, even if they're not actively bringing all their air through their nose into their lungs. It's coming through the trach. But maybe a little bit of that is the taste too. So if you get these really strong smells, sometimes kids will like that, and that'll kind of stimulate them to activate those systems. Or if they're fully on a ventilator, the ventilator is bringing air in from the room. It's bringing air in from the room into the lung, right? So that's why you have to not be in smoky rooms because
Right.
your kid's going to be smoking through their
Right.
vent. But I don't know. So even though it's going past the nose, I found with my son anyway, and he was uncuffed most of his life, but
Mhm.
I felt like he would be able to recognize specifically strong smells.
And I think I'm gonna stop right there on your word recognize and say, you were the expert on your son and you noticed that he could recognize. And I think for some of our kids, we kind of have to be detectives and notice what they're doing. And then we can kind of decipher, are they noticing this sensation or not? And also, do they like it or do they not like it? Some of our kids can say, I don't like that smell. And then we know. Some of our kids might just grimace a little bit and kind of draw back. Some of our kids might get excited. And so as you're thinking about bringing a sensory experience to a child, you might have to be a really great observer, and try to decide, what they're enjoying and what they're not, and what it makes them happy. We all have sensory preferences, and so these medically complex kids do too. And trying to figure that out is sometimes quite a journey.
Mm-hmm. And looking at their past, because if you're a medically complex kid, you did not have a typical childhood. You were probably in the hospital a lot, in the NICU. You weren't given the darkness that you need at night, or you were put in
Yes.
positions that maybe weren't ideal for development because you had to be, right? You had to be sedated on your back, ventilated for whatever reason.
Yeah.
I have a friend, actually, she had a profoundly disabled child too, and her child passed away before mine. And she came in after her child had passed away. She came into the hospital to visit us, and as soon as she walked in the hospital, she stopped, and she was like, the smell of the orange cleaner. She was like, I don't know if I can be in here. And I had never noticed the smell of the orange cleaner until she said that. But that triggered a memory in her being there with her own son, through her sensory. I just thought that it was such a eye-opening moment that I had never considered. And then after that, when I would go to the hospital after my son passed away, I would always smell the orange cleaner and be like, oh, I hate that cleaner.
Yeah. And so smell is this really interesting sense because it's kind of like skips a step and is linked directly to our memory, which is why, if you're walking down the road and you smell cologne from someone you used to date or your first grade teacher, you can smell that smell. And before you even really think about the smell, you think of that person. Our smell is linked to our memory. And I like to talk about this sometimes with our complex kids because if you're noticing that cleaner, are they noticing that cleaner? And does that trigger a memory for them that's not good? And can we think about trying to make if we're talking about smell, make the environment a little more friendly for them, maybe diffuse lavender or, bring a blanket. A beautiful thing that I really love is the smell of mom and the smell of home. And you don't necessarily notice it, but if you're away from home, you do. And one of my things that I like to use to comfort, and a lot of times we talk about younger children with sleep is how I was alerted to this, but if you have a child who might have to go to the hospital for a while, and so they're within all of those smells and it's different, take your shirt that you wore all day long. You've been going back and forth to the hospital. Maybe it's July and it's hot and you're like, oh, this is kind of gross. It really smells like me. That might be really comforting for your child. If it's safe to leave, an item like that in bed with them, that has your smell. So smell can be a really interesting sense that we can hopefully provide some comfort through at times.
And really powerful. And then taste. So a lot of kids that aren't oral feeders, they're fed through G buttons. One thing I wanted to bring up with that is that some of them are able to have some food by mouth. So if they've had a swallow study and what they're safe to receive, if it's then thickened, puree, whatever it is. What we used to do is called pleasure feeding. And so my son, he actually, his first whole food was a full crawfish tail. that he swallowed whole. It's the only actual food he ever swallowed. And my family, who we were visiting family in New Orleans, and they were so happy that his first and
Yes.
only food ever through his mouth was a whole crawfish tail, peeled, of course. But I was putting it in his mouth to pleasure eat is what we'd call it. Oh,
Yeah.
I didn't call it that. That's what whoever taught me called it. It kind of weirded me out, the name, but anyway, we'd put it in his mouth so he could taste it. And so we would do that with a lot of our food. He liked spaghetti sauce, so we'd put just a little bit. It would drool back out, but he got to participate in that meal with us. Or he liked dark chocolate and sweet potatoes. And so as long as it's safe and you know, if you have a speech therapist, talk to them, make sure they're swallowing, you know, where they are. You know, you don't want to put soda in their mouth if they can't have thin liquids, because you don't want them to aspirate, right?
Right.
But whatever's safe, let them explore different tastes. My son hated sweet stuff. He didn't like sugar. And so he liked, you know, food that was less sweet, like really, really dark chocolate. But letting them, so they're able to explore their world and participate through taste, even though they can't oral feed. That doesn't mean they can't ever have anything in their mouth. So I just want to open that up to people.
Yeah, I love that. And again, I'm going to highlight the fact that, you know, you were the one that was noticing what he liked and what he didn't, and you're able to offer that. And we can talk about later arousal, but every time we get sensory input, it kind of wakes our brain up. It's exciting. And so sometimes through some of these, you know, smells or flavors, if it's safe to offer, we're kind of getting to excite that brain. And again, they're kids. Life should be exciting when you're a kid.
Yeah.
So how can we bring that?
Even if you can't eat, even if a kid can't eat, I'm a big believer of, and every family is different, right? So I'm not trying to be all judgy over here, but I'm a big believer that if the child is able and your situation can accommodate it, bring the kid to the kitchen when everyone eats, you know? And I would tube feed my son while we had dinner most of the time, because he was getting the feeling of being satiated, the feeling of being full, and he was smelling our food. Sometimes I would put some in his mouth, sometimes I wouldn't. If it was chaotic, I wouldn't do it, whatever, you know. We had a bunch of kids, or we have a bunch of kids. But he participated in the family unit, and being able to experience his world and the sensations and everything around him. It was very important to him. I could tell, because he really liked it. You could tell he liked it, to be around people and be around the family, and not just be in the other room by himself while the rest of us are eating. So
absolutely.
I just want to encourage people, because sometimes it can feel like a lot, and it is a lot. It is a lot. It is a pain in the ass. Like, let's just be real, to always bring your kid to the table. But if you're able to do it, to make that little extra effort, if you have that in you and you have it in your situation, try to do it.
I love that, because it's community, and we all want to belong no matter what we look like. And just getting to experience those things is so incredibly important. And I think that's why this conversation is important. You know, how can we bring these things to our kids and include them, bring them with us, or bring us to them, or whatever it is. I think it's so important.
There's this other thing with taste too, and it kind of goes into touch. When we were in the NICU, before we knew my son couldn't eat by mouth, the lactation specialist came in, and she had us do something called pleasure breastfeeding.
Okay.
It didn't end up working for us, because I felt like we just looked at each other and thought, this is super strange, but it exists. And I just want people to know that it exists. And it's basically just a way to bond with your baby, even though they're not an oral eater or whatever. You know, if they're an infant and you would typically breastfeed your infant, going skin to skin, just like you would breastfeeding, to create that bond. And I don't know, I'm sure they can get some sort of smell or taste through it. So that's a thing out there, if anybody was wondering.
I've actually never heard of that. That's really interesting. And you get, I mean, that's so many sensory experiences all tied together. But, you know, even with your meal, when you're joining in, like, oh, this is a flavor, we're eating this flavor, so are you, or we were at least all sitting at the table. I think that those pieces are so important.
Yeah, to overall feeling. And it's hard when your kid's in the hospitals, you know, especially if you're an extended NICU stay, to bond with the baby, because you don't see I don't know, I didn't see myself really as a mother until a certain point. someone else is the expert, right? The nurses are the expert, the neonatologists are the expert. That's not true, but this is how it feels. Okay, and then for touch, especially for our really medically complex kids who aren't able to move themselves, they need touch just like we need touch. And sometimes it's hard being a caregiver because you're so busy. There's so much to do to take that time to touch. And then giving other people permission. I don't know. Some people don't want anyone touching their kid. We all have to decide kind of on that. But I do think that importance of touch. So when I get these as a therapist, profoundly disabled kids, like the 10 out of 10 disabled kids, the parents probably think I'm crazy because I touch that kid so much. I don't leave contact with their body for the full hour I'm with them because I just feel like they need the touch so much. So I'm like rubbing their legs, rubbing their head, or if I'm reaching over to grab something, my hand stays on them so they know I'm still there and they're getting that pressure. So it's kind of easy to ignore that sense, I think, for those kids, but I think it's really important that they receive it.
Yes. And, we get comfort from touch. So we can comfort each other with with that sense of touch, patting, rubbing. We can talk about deep touch versus light pressure. Light pressure is kind of ticklish. It's alerting, whereas deep pressure is more calming. But then it's this really interesting piece where we talk about touch along with our sense of proprioception and our vestibular system of developing a map of our body, like a mental map of your body. And if you think about, how do we know where our legs are or our ears or, how all of our body parts relate, a lot of that is because of our sense of touch. We feel it. And so if I'm working with a child, who sometimes with sensory processing, we can work with kids who don't have really great body awareness. They just don't seem to be able to kind of understand where their body is all the time. One of the things I do is bring in touch. Let's touch those legs. Let's touch those arms because sensory information goes to your brain. And so every time you touch an arm, a neck, put hands on a face, all of that information is going up to the brain, and the brain can do so much with it. It can do, emotional regulation that calms me down, that makes me excited. It can do that body map piece. There is so much. And I think you're right. Sometimes these kids don't have people touching them as much or the opportunity to touch other things. And so sometimes, and again, we have to watch the child and try to understand, what they like and what they don't. But sometimes with these kids, I think, has that child ever touched Play-Doh? Or I wonder what they would think about, the sensory blankets that have all of the different feels. And it doesn't have to be fancy, but just, looking around your room. Oh, this blanket has some satin on it. This one has a tassel. Even if they might not always be able to manipulate it, can I put it in their hands? And I'm a big one that likes to talk about it. Oh, don't you, this soft blanket. And again, if we look at typical development, the books for toddlers, what do they have? It's, they open and you get to touch all of the little pieces as you read the words because they want to touch all of those things. It informs their brain. And so sometimes it's bringing, even if the child can't get up and go, what can we bring to them? We might, who knows that, all of the slimy stuff that kids love right now, like the goopy, gooey, that to me, it's like icky. Well, we might assume that feels icky, but we don't know until we try and we offer it. So thinking about the sense of touch and just offering these kids opportunities to feel things, what can we bring to them? If I need to put their hand on it to help them feel it, can I do that? Do they like it? Is it interesting? Because again, medically complex kid is a kid and they're made to explore and develop and learn and grow. And so I do, I try to think about, they want this drive. They want to explore their world. How can I help them do that?
Absolutely. Yeah. And with the auditory and visual system, a lot of our kiddos who are medically complex have some sort of limitation in that. So they might be, CVI is really common in this population. Some sort of hearing loss is common. It's not always. So being legally blind doesn't mean you can't see any sort of light, right? So a lot of these kids who are quote unquote blind, they may be able to have some sort of light perception, or they may be able to see some sort of contrast or some sort of colors that other, especially in CVI, a lot of those kids can see red and yellow. And so when you're looking at CVI materials, you'll see a lot of them are in red and yellow, high contrast, black backgrounds. So I think figuring out, as a clinician, you may not know the intricacies of their vision or hearing loss, or, but being able to figure out where's the best place to treat this kid that they can see what I'm trying to do the best, or they have hearing loss. Where is the frequency of their loss? Can they hear in any frequency better than another frequency? So my son could hear very low sounds, and so he loved Johnny Cash. He was the coolest 5-year-old. We were always jamming to Johnny Cash because where his voice was right where my son could hear.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, he loved it so much. But like looking outside the box, like we don't listen to lullabies and nursery rhymes. We listen to Johnny Cash because we're cool, first of all, and second of all, because he had just the right amount. But being able to meet them there, and just because they have hearing aids or they're quote unquote deaf doesn't mean they're completely deaf. And we still want to try to give them those experiences. And so if they want to blare Johnny Cash, then gosh dang it, blare Johnny Cash. And that's what we did.
And I love it. And think about like the joy and excitement that he would have missed if you hadn't have been in tune to that and brought it. So, you kind of had to bring sound to him in that sense. And then I like to think too, for our kids, if your son loved Johnny Cash and you were at home and you could play it, that's great. For some of our kids, when they go into the hospital, that's a whole different environment, and it's not always fun and it's not always enjoyable. I know that our staffs at the hospitals try so hard, but that can be a tough environment. If we're learning about our child's sensory preferences and what they like, what can I bring with us? Can I have a hospital go bag? Oh, we got to go back into the hospital. I don't know how long it's going to be here. Nobody says, oh, yay, we get to go to the hospital. What can I have in a go bag that I can bring? Can I bring Johnny Cash with us? Can I bring, their favorite blanket? What do they like to experience? Can I bring some of that with us? Because the hours get long, they get long. And what could we help fill them with some positive input?
Right.
And I have to say, I recognize, you're juggling so much. It's a lot. And I don't want to add, one more extra thing on, but maybe something that helps make it more enjoyable.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a necessity that every complex parent should have a go bag. It's just a thing that you have to have. You need to have your trachs and your emergency equipment and your ambu bags, and you also need to have your go bag.
Yeah.
And
have something to enjoy in it.
Right. And then you need to have chocolate in your go bag for you, because that's how you survive. And, talking about the hospital, I was going to talk about this with vision also, is that some kids who can see light, it's really important that they're not in darkness all day, So I think being empowered to establish that routine in the morning, whatever your routine looks like. I'm just going to give arbitrary numbers. At 8 o'clock, your lights go on. Every day that you're able to, because it's not sweltering hot or like freezing, go outside and you get sunlight into your eyes.
Yes.
My son was super photosensitive. He hated bright lights. So we would put sunglasses on, which may, be a moot point, but you needed to go outside because you needed to be in that circadian rhythm of this is daytime. In daytime, the lights are on. If we need to take a nap and we need to turn the lights down, or you're sick or something, that's different. But in typical, you come out with the family, the lights are on, it's loud, you go outside, we're going to do this sort of stuff because we need to activate those systems. And even though you're legally blind and you're legally deaf, my son was legally blind, deafblind, we still found ways. He wasn't in complete darkness, so we could find really bright lights and stuff he liked.
And I think, there's this whole place where we try to bring, toys are a big thing. And, once you understand, what they can or can't see, then can we make some adjustments to bring some of that sensory aspect of play? And so I think, and I think that's a place where your team is really great. You can go in and say, can we figure out exactly, maybe not exactly, but can we figure out what this child can see? Can we figure out, what affordances we have, so that then I can use that understanding to just support their enjoyment and play. Every kid needs to play. It looks different for everybody, but every kid should play. And I think this is a good place, because I know we're going to go into some of the more movement stuff, but then with the light and the sound, I always like to say that safety is a big piece with sensory stimulation. We get kids who have seizures or may be prone to seizures. Sensory input can kick off a seizure, and so we want to talk to your medical team. Sometimes when we talk about movement, and here's where, Chastity, you're perfect for this. You're a PT, you're a mom who's been there. We can really talk about that movement. But when you're thinking about all of these sensory pieces, maybe you're listening to this podcast, you've never thought about it, and you're like, oh my goodness, I never thought about this. I want to do this. A really great place to start, and where I would wholeheartedly recommend you to start, is go to your team, go to your kids' team, go to the medical team and say, hey, I want to start doing all of kind of these sensory things. Can you just give me a safety rundown? Yes, no, what can we look at? What might we want to stay away from? And just always get a medical team to put their eyes on. I know if I'm a clinician and I have a child, I'm responsible for that safety and that, aspect. But when we start talking to these bigger communities, I always like to say, I love this information and I love to share it. Take that to your team and just do a quick check-in and make sure that there's not some aspect that you weren't aware of.
Yeah, I think that's good. And if your kid has seizures, they should be doing a photosensitive test with the EEG. And if they're not, ask for that. So for your next routine EEG, just say, can we, at the end, it just takes a few seconds, can we do this test to see if it's triggering seizures, so that I know I need to stay away from flashing lights? Or
I love it.
Yeah, so that's, hopefully everybody's getting that, but
I always think hopefully, and I always think I want to say it anyway.
Probably not. No, I think it's really good. But figuring out and working with your team, if you have a vision teacher or your ophthalmologist, whoever's following your child's vision loss, help them. Okay, what is his, how far do I need to present things? Does he need high contrast? What kind of lighting? And that way you can set the toys up so that he or she can enjoy it more.
Yes. And that's all sensory stuff, and I love that part where it all connects.
That's right. So vestibular something, we're almost done. We're getting close. My son, school's out today. Yes. So vestibular input is something that I feel like a lot of kids who are really medically complex miss out on. And a lot of it might be fear, especially if your kid has a trach or they're connected to a vent. You don't want to put them in a position where they're going to decannulate, or if their team is not super comfortable. I would prefer a kid with a trach and a vent over, a typically developing kid. Those are my kids. That's what you know what I mean?
And that's why you're so great at what you do.
But not everyone has that experience, right? And so people might be more afraid to put them in certain positions because you don't want to lose the airway. You have to have the airway to live.
You have to.
That being said, making sure you have a safe person who is comfortable with putting that. So if I'm going to be doing a lot of vestibular work with the kid, they have a trach, I'm going to make sure the mom's right there. This is what I'm going to do. Are you okay with it? Do we have our extra trachs? Do we have our stuff that we need? But the kid still needs this vestibular input that normal kids do. And so when you look at a typically developing kid, you have toddlers, they're rolling around on the floor, they're spinning, they're moving their body, they're running and jumping on stuff. And so while we don't need to be like crazy, those more profoundly disabled kids also need this sort of input. And so I like to call it dad play. And all that means is that if you've ever seen a dad with a baby and he's throwing the baby around, you're like,
right.
Oh my goodness. But somehow
you might not be watching all the way.
Right. And I do coach the families that I work with. I coach the moms. Sometimes you need to leave and you need to let the dad do what the dad's supposed to do. They don't even know why they're doing it. They just do it because we're just made this way, right? We nurture and we bring the baby in and we cuddle, and the dads get the baby and they throw him around and they spin him, and this is really good. And if you don't have a dad in the home, or you have a female only home, you're going to have to just learn to lean into this. You're just going to have to be a little reckless and move your baby around a little bit. But just encouraging people, if your kid's in a wheelchair, my son loved to go fast. He loved bumps. He loved spins. And so we would run and we would spin them and we would go on non-smooth surfaces because he loved that input. And if your kid hates it, obviously don't do it.
Different,
but, right. But if they like it, it's okay. It's okay to fly them around the house if you can. If you got one person holding the vent, the other person's holding the baby.
The whole team.
The whole team. But just moving their body and letting them have a chance to develop that vestibular system and to have those experiences, I think it's really important. And so if it's appropriate for your situation, I think you should try to do it.
I love that. And I'm going to speak from the kind of the opposite side of the coin. I'm going to say, I don't work with medically complex kids all the time. So I can come into a situation and say, oh, this kind of does make me nervous thinking about all this movement. And so this is why I really like that water bottle example of the vestibular system, because if you can picture that water bottle, I wish I had one. If you can picture the water bottle in their ear, and it could be positioned this way or whatever, if you can get the water to move, you engage the vestibular system. You activated that part of the brain. You can take that water bottle and shake it up like this, and the water moved and you got lots of stimulation. Great. But even if I take that water bottle and just tilt it some, if the water's moving, you're engaging the vestibular system. So, you can find a place where, I know we all start, what's safe for this child? Yes. And then what is our comfort level with moving this? But I really like to picture those water bottles, because if I get a child and I think, oh, they never get to move, what can I do? If I can picture the water bottles, I can just say, how can I slosh that water? A little bit, a lot, whatever this child needs. How can I kind of move those water bottles and get that stimulation? And then it doesn't have to be complicated, and we don't have to swing your wheelchair start, stop is great, or fast and then slow. How can you move the water in the water bottles? And, in some of your families, maybe dad sloshes it around a lot. Maybe mom moves it a little bit different, but we can all start to think about how we can move it. And I think it's really powerful because you can start to easily envision for this child that water in the water bottle's not moving. It's not sloshing around. It's not moving at all. So even if we start to move it a little bit, hey, that's really exciting.
Right. And I like your perspective. I tend to be extreme. So it's
But I think that's where this works so well, because you are so comfortable.
Sometimes too comfortable, probably. People are probably like, that's enough. But if your child spends 90% of their time laying down in the bed, putting them in the standing frame and going from laying down to standing is going to slosh their water bottle.
Huge. Absolutely.
So don't take a kid who lays down all the time and start spinning them in circles, because they're going to feel awful.
Yes.
Right. We have to build it up, and then what's appropriate for that kid. If they don't tolerate it and they go into seizures or their tone gets really bad, obviously, do what works for that kid. But I like that perspective a lot that you just gave. And the other thing, so I want to talk about upright. So I don't know if we should talk about that or proprioception first, but maybe let's go ahead and talk about upright since we're talking about it. But
okay.
Sometimes if kids are a certain level of disability, they're not, trying to say this in a good way. Not every family has the resources to fully understand what can be done with their child, right? And so sometimes we come across kids who have literally spent their whole lives in bed, or they're always laying down because they're big and they're heavy or whatever it is, right? So we talked about on this podcast before the importance of being upright. It's really important for our lungs. It's really important for our bowels. it's important for a lot of our body, for the weight to be on our bones to help strengthen our bones.
Right.
But I'd like to talk about with you arousal, and specifically in the brain, the reticular activating system, and why it's important to be upright at least part of the day.
Okay. So when sensory information, all of it that comes in is going to our brain. And that's just sort of this core concept that you've just got to grasp. Anything that comes in, sight, sound, movement, that vestibular information, the target is its brain. And so kind of as it goes to the brain, and as it moves through the brain, it goes through your brainstem. So all of your nerves from like fingertips, toe tips, all of your body, kind of all of those nerves travel towards the center. So a lot of that's going to go to our spinal cord. And at the top of the spinal cord, there's your brainstem, and your brain just sits right on top of it. And at some point, all of the sensory information is going to go through that brainstem. Inside the brainstem is something called the reticular activating system. And the reticular activating system activates the brain. That's its job. And when sensory information gets to the reticular activating system, I like to picture this as like a little person. And every time sensory information gets to that little activating system, it shouts up to the brain, hey, be alert, get ready, something important is about to happen. And it kind of wakes the brain up because your brain wants, when information's coming, it kind of knows it's supposed to pay attention. So it wants to know that it's coming. When sensory information, so I should step back. The brain kind of likes to, if there's nothing else going on, if it doesn't need to be active, it's going to try to conserve energy. We're just sort of made that way. Our brains and our bodies will conserve energy. So if sensory information isn't getting to the reticular activating system, and that activating system isn't shouting up to the brain, hey, be alert, get ready, be awake, then the brain's going to kind of rest. Once we start getting sensory information to that reticular activating system, it says, hey, brain, wake up. And your brain's going to start to wake up and be more alert. And so this is where we can use sensory information to help kind of wake up and affect your arousal. So just if you are laying down, just sitting upright changes the water in that water bottle, which sends sensory information to your brain. And so it travels through that reticular activating system. And so it kind of helps your brain to wake up a little bit. Hey, be alert. Something is happening. And we can talk about it with vestibular information, but really with all of the senses are going to work this way. So we can help to bring someone into kind of an awake and alert state with the sensory information that we're offering. Now, I should say too, that this also works it could continue to work. So if your brain's awake and alert and you keep sending sensory information and the reticular activating system keeps saying, wake up, wake up, wake up, brain, at some point you can get overstimulated and your brain says like, oh my gosh, I have too much. And so this can go to the too much side of things. But absolutely just sitting up can help to wake your whole brain up. It's amazing. Or, offering those smells or tastes or feels.
Yeah, that's such an important thing, I think, for everyone to understand, that just the act of being upright wakes up your brain. Now, I will say with kids who are wheelchair bound, they get really sore sitting in their chair all the time. Their bottoms get sore, their back gets sore. So it's really important. They're not going to be able all the time, usually, be able to be upright all day long like maybe a typically developing kid would, right? So you got to find what works for your kid, for your situation, for your seating situation, for their skin situation. But having times where they're upright. And my son loved to lay down. He would lay down on the floor all the time. But he would also be upright throughout the day to kind of activate, to be alert. So it's a good piece of information.
And I want to say too, sitting upright has so many benefits that we talk about it a lot. But, if your child is laying in bed, and I know there's so many kinds of beds, but if it's soft enough that it can kind of jiggle, I love the water bottle piece because anytime we're shaking the water, we're getting vestibular information. So if I was to put a water bottle on a bed and sit beside it and kind of jump up and down and wiggle, that water would move. With kids, I'm going to do this playfully. And then you have to have the piece, do they like it? Do they not? But some kids think it's hilarious for the bed just to move, a little bit and get them jiggling around. And I mostly want to think about, I hope that this message is empowering, not that, oh my gosh, I never thought of all this sensory stuff. And now I have all of this extra stuff that I wasn't doing that I need to do. I hope it's not that, and more of, there's so many simple opportunities that I could add into every day. It doesn't have to be fancy. I don't have to have some big equipment. I can do it at my comfort level. I can obviously follow whatever safety guidelines there are. But these are little ways that, as a caregiver, you are stimulating that child's brain. You're helping them develop and grow and learn every single time you let them touch or see or feel or move. And I hope that message is more empowering. You're in the bed and you're making the bed and you're like, oh, maybe they want to feel this blanket, or, oh, I'll just, rub their arm, or I'll sing and talk to them. It's opportunities. And every time you do that, you are literally lighting up your child's brain. And I think that is just really amazing.
Yeah, I'd like to echo that too, because I feel like we all feel mom shame, right? No matter what kind of mom you are, whether you have typically developing kids or profoundly disabled kids, you always feel like, well, I kind of suck.
Right. I'm not doing this, or
this is not another,
I'm doing
right. This is not another reason to suck, right? Like,
no,
you're not. You're
not.
doing a great job. You're doing a great job. This is just information, so you have it in your brain. And this isn't like, oh, great, now I have another job. And also, if you have other people helping you, if you have therapists in your life, you have nurses, just send them the podcast and say, hey, listen to this, because they're there to help, right?
Yeah.
Not everything is your job.
No.
You got to employ your team.
Yeah. And hopefully, as we're talking, we're giving you some simple ways to pull it in. It shouldn't be complicated. It should be a part of your everyday life, because sensory processing and integration is part of everyday life. And like we said, if we say that this is for everyone, we actually have to mean that this is for everyone. And so our medically complex kids are everyone's too.
Mm-hmm.
So kind of just thinking about this lens and sharing it with this population.
Well, the last thing I'd like to talk about, and then I'll let you have your last thoughts, is talking about the proprioceptive system. But when we're talking about that, sometimes there tends to be an assumption of what a child can or cannot understand.
Mm-hmm.
A good example of this, I've talked about this on the podcast before, but my son went to a play with his school. So there was typically developing kids, and then his classroom, which was medically fragile. And during a certain part of the play, the sad part came up, and he started crying. And when he would cry, he would cry. He was loud, inconsolable, and people thought maybe he's uncomfortable. And then the funny part happened right after that, and then he started laughing. And his teachers, his typically developing teachers, were so amazed that he was following the play and that he understood, because they had made an assumption. Now, I love his teachers. I'm not saying anything negative about anybody. We all do it. I do it. This is like literally my job, and I had a kid like this. So this is just something we, with human nature, do, but not assuming that a kid doesn't understand or can't understand. So bringing that into the proprioceptive, when you're working on proprioception, I'm moving your right foot. I was
just going to say the same thing. We're on the same page. Yes.
Oh, good. Okay. Yeah. This is your left shoe. I'm putting on your left foot. Let's count. These are your toes, and I'm touching the toes. You have 5 toes. This is your foot. I'm giving it deep pressure into your foot. I'm putting your sock on your right leg, and not assuming that they don't understand what right is or left is or the leg is or the arm is. Giving them that information, and then what they do with it in their brain, that's not your job. Your job is to assume that they understand, and giving them the information that they can about their body and space. I'm washing your hair, right? Yes. I'm going to wipe your mouth. Instead of just going up, blindsiding them, wiping their mouth, tell them what you're doing. It's okay, I'm going to prepare my mouth now to be wiped. I'm going to make it stiffer so you can wipe it. I have a little girl who's totally nonverbal, and she understands everything. I'm going to wipe your mouth. She puckers for me so I can wipe it, and so, but if somebody just saw her out, they might think she doesn't understand anything. She does.
And, two pieces. One, talking about, we have to give them the opportunity to understand. If we're not talking about your leg and your arm and your hair, then that's how we build back to typical development. How does a typical child understand that? We do those things. And then, I think there's this piece where no matter who you are, your body is your body and we're protective over it. And, for some of our kids, especially some of our medically complex kids, we do so much to them, but it's their body. And so I think when you're doing something like that, you are layering so many good things on top of so many good things. You get the sensory aspect, you get that body awareness aspect, but you also are giving them control. I'm going to wipe your mouth. You're not just, running in there and doing it. Gosh, we could unpack that for ages.
That's a whole nother podcast, consent.
Yeah.
But it is.
I do think,
even if they can't verbally consent, okay, you're going to change my diaper now. Letting them know so that they're part of the conversation. They're part of what's happening to them and they have some sort of bodily autonomy. And if you're a caregiver or you're a parent and you go into the hospital, do not be afraid to ask every new nurse who comes on shift. Because this is the thing, I worked in a hospital for 15 years. It's just work. You get used to it. Everyone's like this. There's sick kids in every single room. And sometimes you forget. And so, hey, I'm so happy you're our nurse today. I would just ask you, would you please mind before you do anything to him, to talk to him, acknowledge him, let him know what you're doing, and then talk through the steps as you're doing it. We're about to put an IV in. The first thing we're going to do is I'm going to lay stuff out on the table. And that's okay as a parent to come in and advocate like that. You don't need to be confrontational. Just he understands. So please speak to him just like you would a kid who could talk, right? So
absolutely.
I want to empower parents like that too. That it's really important that you make sure everyone's on that same page. To help them have
and it's so neat if you're a parent who does that. Sometimes as a clinician, you're right. We do. We go through it so many times, but then if you're a parent and you say something like that to me, you've been a light to me for that day because I say, thank you for that reminder to slow down and remember that these are all humans. These are all kids. So sometimes not only are you advocating for your kid, but you're helping make my day as a clinician better. You're helping me care for everyone better. We all need those reminders.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, you can change the whole culture of a floor.
You can.
By nicely asking one person to do that.
Yep.
I've seen it. Okay. Are there any last thoughts that you have before we sign off?
I think I've already said them, but I think they're so important. I'm going to say them again.
Perfect.
Number one, I hope that you are empowered and inspired by this. This is not a chore. It shouldn't be hard to do. But if you start thinking about your sensory systems, you think about how much is available to see and hear and feel and touch and smell and taste and all of those things. So it's almost just like seeing the world through a different lens and saying, what can I offer? What can I bring to this child? And I think this is an exciting place where we are with sensory processing and integration. And we're saying, if we mean this is for everyone, we really mean this is for everyone. And you are an everyone. So come join in and come ask questions and come be a part of our community. And then again, because this is how my brain works, always, in a podcast, I talk about, circling the mountain to get your information, to build your foundation. In a podcast, I can bring you and circle the mountain at the bottom and give you a foundation of some understanding. I can't get you to the top of the mountain. I can't apply this for you and your child. So take this information and then use your team. Think about, your role in this and keep going up that mountain with your providers who can inform you more on what opportunities you are. If you have an OT, say, hey, I'd really like to know more about this. I'm always an advocate of actually asking, what is safe? What can I do? I want to find the room here that is the blend. So, we're at kind of the middle of the mountain here. Really get your team involved to keep going with these pieces, if that makes sense.
It does. It makes a lot of sense. And tell people where they can find you.
Yes, I have a website. It's called brainexecutiveprogram.com. I did release a book that's about sensory modulation. So a lot of this information is in there. I will say that book is written in kid language. So heads up if you take a look at the book. I tried to make it entertaining for our kids to read and engage with. But also, this intersection of sensory health and the medically complex community is we're kind of putting these pieces. I'm so excited to be here because we're kind of like merging these two communities. So I would say, Chastity, wherever you feel comfortable with your social media or mine or wherever, this would be a great conversation. And my contact information is on my website. If you have more questions or want to think about something more, I love this stuff. Reach out. We can brainstorm together about how to get this input for different kids because, I have found caregivers are amazing what they will come up with to do. And then I'll say, I'm so glad you thought of that idea and shared it because now I can share it with other families. What a great way to get, whatever sensory information. So to me, this is a conversation starter.
Absolutely. Well, you are truly an expert in your field. I'm so honored that you agreed to come on to the podcast. I want everyone to go and look at your book, How to Be a Brain Executive, right? You also created a sensory safe hurricane planner because you live in Florida, which is super cool. I would have never have thought to do that. And you are working on a parent course that's going to be really great. So everyone can go follow you on working, right? We're working. You'll do it eventually, right? But it's great because you're giving your expertise and you're making it available to everybody, which is what I wanted to highlight, by saying that. And I appreciate that so much.